Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 6th, 1994. Actually, it was June 4th, 1994, but Oliver L. North won the primary to become Virginia's Republican nominee for U.S. Senate. Oliver North is most known, rightly so, for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, where as a member of President Reagan's National Security Council, he cooked up the scheme to divert funds from the sales of arms in Iran to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. He also had his fingers in lots of other sketchy pies in the late 80s, to put it mildly. That scheme, we've done episodes on Iran-Contra before, but that scheme was exposed in late 86. In summer 87, North was part of the very high-profile hearings around Iran-Contra. He was granted immunity, but he was also indicted like 16 times, faced a trial. Anyway, it was a whole thing in the late 80s, very high profile, and for most Americans, that may have been the last time they saw or heard of Oliver North, until this moment, 8 years later, when North is back on the scene, one election away from becoming a U.S. Senator. Let's call this another piece of evidence that completely refutes F. Scott Fitzgerald's quote that there are no second acts in American lives. For my money, that is like the least accurate famous quote in history. There are definitely second acts and third acts and fourth acts and more in American lives. And here to discuss Oliver North's second act is, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Before we get to talking about Oliver North, I just want to quickly mention, everyone knows this, I think, because we're running spots for it, but it is the Radiotopia fundraiser. I want to take a brief moment to talk about a little incentive that we are layering in. So if you haven't heard, what we're doing is, if you become a member of Radiotopia at the $13 a month level, which is what we're asking people to do, we will give you access to this master document that we use to make the show. You've heard us refer to this from time to time, but it's called the Big List of Ideas. One of you want to describe briefly what this thing is?
Sure. Well, it is a 126-page document that includes all of the ideas that we've generated for each day of the year. I mean, now that we're cycling into year 2, we really do have every day of the year with events that happened on that day and all of our little notes about, which one we're going to do, what we think about it, which could be really interesting, who good guests could be.
And this is the masterwork mostly of producer Jacob Feldman. But then Kellie, this is what we use to go in. We pick some options each time, and then we decide which one we want to do.
How we pick our shows, how we pick our guests, who would be a good guest, who would be a good fit for this topic, what we're most excited to talk about, some things that we're like, didn't know that happened.
Yeah. And so what we are going to do is we're going to let people see this master list. I don't know if this is a good idea to just open it up, but if you prove to us, or you know what, we'll trust you, but if you just tell us you've become a Radiotopia member, we will share the Google Doc with you, and you can go in and you can cruise through and see all the things throughout the year. You can add comments and tell us what's interesting to you. You can tell us when your birthday is and, comment with each other, whatever. It's a bit of an experiment, a bit of an incentive to become a member of Radiotopia. So we will get on with the episode. But again, if you become a Radiotopia member, or if you have become a Radiotopia member, just tell us that you've done that. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can send us a note on Twitter or Instagram, and I will then add you as a member of this Google Doc, and we'll see what happens. Anyway, let's move on and talk about Oliver North. So we should do a little of, North's history and so forth. But Kellie, I mean, do you want to start there, just like the second act's idea? Like, people just keep coming around, right?
Yeah, I mean, so even though Oliver North really has this sketchy, problematic past within the military and within, the legal world, it's interesting because he's beloved by the right. He's certainly beloved by the Christian right. People love him in the evangelical movement, which is also it's already sort of at a height. But the fact that, he is one of their heroes, I think motivates him in a lot of ways to say, hey, I've got fans. I've got people that will vote for me, that want me in this political position. And he thinks that he can really thwart the establishment by running on a platform that will sort of push back on all these ideas that he finds, to be problematic and push back on the Clinton administration and, take his political aspirations to a whole new level.
Well, yeah, we should get to that because there is a little drain the swampiness to his message here, which is very interesting given, I think, in our own country, you could say he was the swamp, but there's echoes for today. But something you said there is really interesting, actually, which is, he's beloved in certain circles. And, at first glance, you look at the story and you think, oh, there's this 8-year gap and maybe people forget and North's reputation is rehabilitated. But I think what you're getting at, and Niki, tell me if you agree here, but actually, I think a lot of people saw North's role in Iran-Contra and him at those hearings. People on the left saw that as here's this guy talking about all these awful things that went down. But some people saw that as heroic and defiant, and he was the good soldier. So there's a little bit of rehabilitating his reputation, but also just capturing and continuing what some people saw as admirable or at least, reasonable behavior.
Yeah, I mean, on the right, Ollie North was a hero from 1987 on. He was the one who was willing to do what needed to be done. Scene from A Few Good Men when Colonel Jessup is like, I'm the one on the wall. He was the one on the wall. And conservatives loved that. And it opens up this really interesting rift because who didn't love it? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan really did not like Oliver North. And so you have this conservative movement where Reagan, in 1994, he's leaving the political scene. He makes known his Alzheimer diagnosis and he retires from politics. And here you have Ollie North, who Reagan despises and actually ends up coming out against. And the conservative movement doesn't care what Reagan says in this moment. They embrace North.
Yeah. So let's talk about the way this race plays out a little bit. We're marking here the moment when he wins the Republican primary. We should say that he goes on, he does not win the general election, to spoil it. And part of that is because there was a third party candidate who is sort of endorsed by the establishment Republicans. So this does sort of split the Republicans a little bit. There's, of course, Chuck Robb is an incumbent here as the Democrat, and he ends up winning. So, it's not a huge shock that an incumbent Democrat wins, but North does get pretty close. He gets 40% of the vote. And there's 11% that goes to that independent. So, he's definitely viable in this race.
Yeah, he's especially viable because he raises so much money. I mean, one of the things that North taps into that is a signal fire on the horizon is he is able to raise so much money from this committed, enthusiastic base. And he is able to get those, and you don't quite have the infrastructure for really small dollar donations, but smaller dollar donations. And so he has a bank of millions and millions of dollars, and he is raising far more money than people would have expected because he's tapping into this conservative fundraising machine that is going to become, a powerhouse in American politics in the coming years.
But I'd also add that he's tapping into this very emotional, political, social backlash of the 1990s. Yeah. I see the 1990s, as this very multicultural moment, as a moment in which you have all of these different contending social factions about what is progressive and what is not. And there's new conversations about sexuality and just there's so much happening in this moment. It's also sort of a good moment for hip hop. But when Oliver North gives his speech. He says, Virginians are sick and tired of a Congress run by backslapping good old boys and a White House governed by a bunch of 20-something kids with an earring and an axe to grind. And this, for him, very much paints the portrait of like who he thinks is running the show and who he thinks is messing up, the political landscape. And then he goes on to say, I've got news for them. They will never see Ollie North crawling up the steps of the Capitol Hill to kiss their big fat rings. So I'm like, wow, okay.
So
he's letting them know.
Yeah. Interesting tidbit there that you mentioned, the music release there. Ollie North did walk out to Illmatic by Nas for a lot of his campaign. No, I'm joking.
Could you imagine?
But yes, 94, very good year for him. You're right. But to this point, though, to your actual point about the sort of multiculturalism in that moment, and the notion of like politics trying to speak to a big tent. I mean, to me, this campaign feels extremely 1994 in the sense that it has maybe gotten over that notion, and it is built in many ways, and this feels very modern, right? And so you can see this as perhaps one of the first modern campaigns in this way, but it is built upon breaking up the electorate and fracturing everything, and then trying to pick up as many of those fractures as possible just to get over the line. And Niki, you study this era and this kind of politics, but that seems like the real hallmark here.
Yeah, it's a real transitional moment, and you see this in the 1994 congressional elections as well, when Newt Gingrich is both running a deeply polarizing partisan campaign, but he's promoting the Contract with America, which is supposed to be this broad-based issue-focused agenda that doesn't even mention Republicans or Democrats or Bill Clinton. And so you see the splitness in this moment. And of course, the Republican Party is going to choose that first option and not the second one. But it's a party in transition. And there are a lot of other forces at work. I mean, you see in North's campaign a little bit of Pat Buchanan, right? That fire-breathing culture warrior is definitely part of North's campaign. But you also see Ross Perot. The idea of this outsider swooping in, throwing off the establishment. I mean, in 1994, everyone running for office is trying to crack the Perot vote because it had so upended the 1992 election. And that anti-establishment language, certainly not new in the 1990s, but it was intense because of the amount of the vote that Perot was able to get 2 years earlier.
But part of it feels like just a shamelessness in casting yourself as the outsider when, I can't think of anything more insidery than sitting on the National Security Council and like secretly moving funds to try and like win the Cold War. That feels pretty swampy. And then like 8 years later, you just get to say, no, I'm an outsider. Let's take it to these guys. So
shamelessness, I think, is a key word here. But also there was this sense that he had gone rogue inside the Reagan administration that allowed him that kind of cover. And I think that that's what he's drafting off of.
Yeah, gone rogue was not the reason that he had to testify before.
No.
I don't think they would have phrased it as, you just went a little rogue. Yeah, but yes, I agree. I see what you're saying. Sorry, Kellie.
But in some ways, I think people link very much the military and the political machine. So the fact that he has this long career in the military doesn't quite make him the outsider that he is positioning himself to be. In some ways, I think he's very much an insider because he went to West Point, and from then on, he sort of has always had his, hand in some sort of military circle.
Yeah. So I grew up in the D.C. area, and this was like very early in my sort of just being aware of local politics and stuff. The only thing I remember from this race going on is that some of the opposition bumper stickers that you'd see on cars if you were driving around did not say Chuck Robb's name. They instead just said South. And I always thought that was very clever. Maybe a little too clever.
Sorry,
that delay suggested.
Exactly.
I was like, South, what?
Yeah. But so you'd see these North things, and then you see a bunch of cars with South on them. And, it was clever branding, and this campaign did get a little dirty in that way. And actually, there was there's a documentary film, a PBS, that POV series. There was a documentary about this race called A Perfect Candidate. And I watched a little bit of that, and I also watched an interview with the filmmakers on Charlie Rose. And they talked a little bit about, to put this in context, about just a couple years earlier, right, that film, The War Room, about the 92 Bill Clinton election came out. We did a group watch of that last year. And, in that film, you can kind of think of like James Carville and George Stephanopoulos as like the angel and the devil sitting on the shoulders of modern politics or whatever. Stephanopoulos still has a little bit of that like doe-eyed, like, speak to everyone, inspire everyone. And Carville is like very cynical, fracture the electorate, just do what it takes. And they talked about how by 94, the Carville vision had basically won. The campaign was entirely just about like, get Oliver North out there. There's no such thing as bad press. We don't care if the news is bad. We don't care, just like win each news cycle, be pugilistic, break up the electorate. And again, I think it just is an extremely 94 moment.
Yeah. Another factor here is that, Charles Robb, who is the son-in-law of former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, also sort of has some past mistakes. He, admitted to extramarital affairs. He also had some other morally questionable behavior. But that doesn't cancel him. And the fact that he is able to get reelected, I think says something about how people are able to recover from mistakes made, especially when they're honest about them.
Yeah, though that also makes me really think of this as a very modern type of election in the sense that you can run two very, very unpopular candidates against each other.
Yeah.
And they will eat into each other. And, as long as your tribe is on board, that's all that matters. And, we saw, obviously, like in 2016, we saw the two least popular candidates in history running up against each other. And, someone's going to win.
But it's interesting, too, like how one woman sort of takes him down, which is Nancy Reagan. I mean, Nancy Reagan like pushes back on an Oliver North in a way that I still think has a lot of sway with voters at the time. And she just says, I know that Oliver North has a great deal of trouble separating fact from fantasy. He lied to my husband. He lied about my husband. She's not a fan, and she does not endorse him. And I think that hit really caused an election that was, somewhat close and maybe could have gotten him a victory, sort of sealed the deal on him not winning.
Yeah, you see the fracture in the Republican Party between the establishment, which is now like Reaganites, and this more fringy conservative movement that are coming into conflict in this moment.
Yeah, and especially then, Nancy Reagan says something like that 10 days before the election. It's really important to keep in mind that, if you're a Republican who is swayed by that, you don't have to sway all the way over to voting for Chuck Robb, the Democrat, because there's Marshall Coleman, who's a former Republican, sitting there as the independent.
Yeah.
And he's the one who picks up 11% of the vote. I know it's always really hard to speculate about how much of that vote would have gone to North, but, Robb beats North by 3 points, and the independent gets 11 points. And so, there's a good chance that was a really big factor.
Yeah,
there.
That's a huge percentage for independent, So those totally. Numbers do add up, and they do wind up taking away from a potential victory when you realize that it's such a close margin.
And we should say that Oliver North loses the Senate race, but he doesn't necessarily lose in the big picture, because what he takes out of this Senate race, he raises something like $20 million from primarily direct mail. And he takes that mailing list and continues to fundraise off of it after the Senate campaign. He starts his own conservative talk radio show. Many years down the line, he will become the president of the NRA. So he remains a fixture in the conservative movement long after this Senate race. So he still exerts quite a lot of influence, even though he is not in the Senate.
So on that point, and as we start to wrap up, I mean, how does this make you think about this moment now in terms of people who just, even if their exit from politics is a little tarnished, and I think a lot of people in the Trump administration, you can say that about them, they stick around. And they, when you have a certain level of name recognition, I suppose, that is something you can just carry forward. But I mean, do you see that playing out? Are you seeing echoes of this?
I say absolutely. I think everybody has like these moments that are not so great. But what's interesting is that give it a few years and everyone finds ways to recover or bounce back. I mean, we've seen this in very extreme ways, but we've also seen how it is totally plausible to be able to recover your reputation and start again anew.
And I'll just say, not even recover, but also like embrace and pivot and sort of own the things.
Sometimes surpass.
And you see that in a lot of different ways. So somebody like G. Gordon Liddy, who was central to the Watergate affair, to the Watergate scandal, he has his own conservative talk radio show. So if you have a niche that's small enough, but passionate enough, you can still wield a good deal of influence, even if you haven't been rehabilitated more broadly. I mean, I have to say, the thing that this makes me think about is another member of the military, Michael Flynn, who is certainly discredited, I think, in society at large, but has a very committed base of support that he, will he be the next Ollie North? I don't know, but it is not outside the realm of possibility.
All right. Well, we will leave it on that note. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
My opponent is a document-shredding, Constitution trashing, Commander-in-Chief bashing, Ayatollah-loving, arms-dealing, criminal-protecting, resume-enhancing, Noriega-coddling, Swiss banking, law-breaking, letter-faking, self-serving, snake oil salesman who can't tell the difference between the truth and a lie.
Radiotopia.